On the 28th of March, 1757, in the center of Paris, a crowd assembled to witness an event so gruesome that even veteran executioners faltered in carrying it out. A man named Robert-François Damiens was about to suffer a fate that would make him the final individual in French history to be executed by being torn apart by horses, a punishment so savage it would compel a nation to reevaluate its notions of justice. This was not the execution of a notorious killer or a war criminal, but rather a domestic servant whose only transgression was daring to lay a hand on the sacred embodiment of absolute monarchy. The tale of Damiens' death is not merely a relic of medieval savagery, lingering into the Enlightenment era. It illustrates a clash between a fading world desperately holding on to divine rule and an emerging one beginning to scrutinize the roots of political power. The events of that March day would reverberate from the halls of Versailles to the intellectual salons of Paris and eventually fuel the revolutionary fire that would engulf France decades later. To grasp the weight of this episode, we must first understand the man at its heart. Robert-François Damiens was no radical thinker or strategic dissenter. He was an ordinary man, propelled by despair into an act of defiance that would exact the highest price. His story exposes how absolute authority, when challenged even slightly, can retaliate with ferocious violence. The chosen method of execution, being torn limb from limb by horses, had long been reserved for the gravest offenses against the crown. Referred to in French law as Écartèlement, this execution was meant not only to extinguish life, but to dramatize the monarch's total dominion over both body and spirit. It was as much a theatrical spectacle as it was a judicial sentence, a warning to all who might dream of defiance. But that day in 1757, something went awry. What was intended to reinforce royal dominance instead laid bare its vulnerability. The horses, the executioners, even the spectators appeared to recoil from the sheer brutality unfolding before them. What should have been a quick, controlled demonstration of state justice turned into an extended torment, as Damiens stubbornly clung to life while his body was torn apart. Detailed records of the execution, preserved by those who bore witness, read like scenes from a nightmare. Yet this was no fiction. It played out in front of thousands and was chronicled by officials who were at once entranced and appalled. These accounts offer a stark lens into how a so-called civilized society can embrace savagery when its power is under siege. This is the account of the last man to be drawn and quartered in France. A narrative that exposes not only the depths of human cruelty, but also the point at which even those inflicting the violence could no longer bear it. It is a story of authority, defiance, and the harrowing cost of resisting power. In an era when monarchs asserted their right to rule as divinely ordained, France, in 1757, teetered on the brink between two diverging realities. On one side stood the entrenched absolute monarchy of Louis XV, a political system that had reached its apex under the reign of his forebear, Louis XIV, famously known as the Sun King. This was a kingdom where the king's decree held the force of law itself, where opposing royal authority wasn't merely rebellion but blasphemy, a violation against God, who was believed to have installed the Bourbon dynasty as France's rightful rulers. In 18th century France, royal power extended far beyond governance. The king was regarded as the divine's earthly embodiment, his person sacred and untouchable. To raise a hand against the king wasn't just violence, it was symbolic deicide, an affront to the cosmic order. This doctrine, known as the divine right of kings, had been nurtured over centuries as a way to legitimize unchecked sovereignty and stifle any doubt about the monarch's supremacy. Yet, beneath this facade of absolute dominance, France was undergoing a profound transformation in both society and thought. Enlightenment ideas were coursing through the intellectual circuits of Parisian salons and provincial cafes alike. Thinkers such as Voltaire and Diderot were openly challenging the traditional power structures, including both church and crown. The foundational beliefs of the Ancien Regime were being scrutinized and increasingly rejected by a more literate and critical public. This friction between tradition and modernity created a volatile atmosphere at Versailles. Louis XV, in contrast to his illustrious ancestor, lacked the commanding presence of a strong sovereign. He was perceived as indecisive, easily swayed, and more absorbed by courtly pleasures and mistresses than the responsibilities of governance. Meanwhile, the 7 Years' War was bleeding the state's finances dry, and a series of military humiliations further eroded the monarchy's reputation. Once unassailable, the throne was now being questioned, sometimes in hushed tones, sometimes boldly in public discourse. It was into this charged climate that Robert-François Damiens emerged, a man whose very lack of distinction made his bold action all the more startling. Born in 1715 in the small village of La Tuileries near Arras, Damiens hailed from the lowest strata of French society. He was a domestique, a servant who drifted between employers, never securing a stable foothold in the rigid class structure of pre-revolutionary France. Damiens had served in several roles, including in the homes of members of the Parliament of Paris, the judicial body that frequently clashed with royal authority. Through these positions, he would have encountered the political friction of the time, overhearing discussions critical of royal policies and the escalating dissatisfaction with absolutism. Some scholars believe these exposures may have shaped his eventual decision to act. The France that forged Damiens was a nation of glaring disparities and fixed social boundaries. At the pinnacle of society sat the king, ensconced in the opulence of Versailles and surrounded by his dazzling court. Just below him were the aristocrats, living lives of luxury and inherited status. Though increasingly disconnected from the actual mechanics of governance, the clergy constituted another elite tier, exempt from taxes and wielding immense sway over the spiritual and daily lives of the populace. At the bottom of this rigid hierarchy were the commoners, peasants, craftsmen, and household servants like Damiens, burdened with taxation and denied any real political agency. On the evening of the 5th of January, 1757, around 6 o'clock, Robert-François Damiens carried out an act that would determine his destiny and rattle the very pillars of French society. As King Louis XV exited the palace, about to step into his carriage, Damiens emerged from the cluster of courtiers and stabbed the monarch with a small blade. The injury was minor, barely piercing the layers of the king's winter garments. But the symbolic shock it delivered was immense. The assault unfolded in the marble forecourt of Versailles, in plain sight of numerous witnesses. Damiens made no attempt to flee. In fact, he seemed almost stunned by his own deed. Upon being apprehended by the royal guard, he is said to have declared, "I did not mean to kill the king, but to touch him, to make him reflect on the misery of his people." If true, this remark offered a vital glimpse into Damiens' mindset. He was not committing regicide, but rather performing a desperate act of symbolic resistance. What followed was utter chaos. Believing himself mortally wounded, the king began his confession and preparations for last rites. The royal court plunged into turmoil, with rumors quickly spreading that the attack might be part of a coordinated plot. Security around the monarchy was tightened dramatically, and a sweeping inquiry was initiated to identify any potential conspirators. What made the incident all the more bewildering was its apparent lack of planning. Unlike many other assassination attempts in European history, this one bore no trace of an organized conspiracy. Damiens appeared to have acted entirely on his own, propelled by motives even he couldn't fully articulate. Under interrogation, he offered explanations that were often erratic and self-contradictory, citing divine prompting at one moment, political grievances the next. His weapon, a simple penknife, was hardly suited to assassination. The shallow nature of the wound implied either a lack of skill or, as Damiens himself suggested, an intent merely to make contact with the king rather than end his life. Nonetheless, under the doctrine of divine monarchy, any physical breach of the king's sanctified body was regarded as a heinous violation. The ensuing investigation exposed the deep-rooted paranoia permeating the French state. Damiens endured repeated interrogations, often under torture, as authorities scrambled to unearth a broader conspiracy that likely never existed. Every detail of his life was dissected, his personal relationships probed, his recent activities scrutinized with obsessive precision. The government's reaction to the attack exposed both the resilience and the vulnerability of absolute monarchy. On one hand, Damiens was swiftly apprehended, and the full machinery of royal security was promptly activated, a testament to the state's formidable power. On the other hand, the feverish investigation and the choice to impose the most excruciating punishment imaginable revealed a regime gripped by fear, willing to unleash severe violence to reinforce its dominance. Legal action against Robert-François Damiens commenced immediately following his capture, though the proceedings were largely symbolic. In a system where the monarch served as both the ultimate lawmaker and the injured party, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. The trial was not a genuine inquiry into guilt which no one disputed, but a deliberation on what form of punishment would adequately address such an extraordinary affront to royal dignity. Ironically, Damiens was tried by the Parliament of Paris, the very high court where he had once served in a humble capacity. Observers at the time recognized the dark irony in the fact that he was being judged by an institution where he had likely first encountered opposition to monarchical authority. The magistrates, however, did not extend any leniency. They knew that the maintenance of the existing order required a powerful message that anyone daring to violate the sanctity of the king's body would face the harshest retribution imaginable. The formal accusation against Damiens was parricide, not in the literal sense of killing a parent, but in the ceremonial sense of attempting to murder the father of the nation. This charge carried with it a sentence not merely of death, but of execution by a method designed to inflict maximum suffering and display. According to long-standing, though rarely used legal precedent, such a crime warranted dismemberment by horses. The judgment was delivered with grave solemnity. Damiens would be led to the Place de Grève, the historical venue for state executions in Paris. There, his body would first be mutilated with burning pincers, molten lead poured into the open wounds, and his right hand, the offending hand, incinerated with sulfur. Only after these agonies would he be bound to 4 horses and forcibly torn apart. What remained of him would be burned, his ashes scattered by the wind. This painstakingly choreographed sequence of punishment was intended to symbolically reflect the offense. Just as Damiens had dared to desecrate the royal body, so too would his own body be desecrated and annihilated in full public view. The spectacle was not incidental. It was meant as a chilling warning to anyone contemplating defiance against the throne. Preparations for the execution took several months. During this time, Damiens was confined to the Conciergerie, a prison infamous for its harsh conditions. While there, he was subject to relentless questioning, torture, and repeated demands to confess the existence of co-conspirators who, most likely, were figments of the investigators' paranoia. Authorities struggled to comprehend how such a significant offense could have been carried out by a lone, unremarkable man. Accounts from the time depict Damiens' conduct during his confinement as unpredictable and inconsistent. At moments, he appeared accepting of his fate. He sometimes asserted that divine will had driven him, while on other occasions, he claimed his motives stemmed from compassion for the suffering masses of France. These conflicting statements only deepened the mystery surrounding his mental stability and intent, yet none of it changed the predetermined course of justice. The morning of the 28th of March, 1757, broke cold and overcast in Paris. From early hours, throngs of people began to fill the Place de Grève, the city's ancient site for executions, where countless lives had ended over centuries. Situated near the Seine and ringed by aged stone buildings, the square was turned into a grim arena, complete with elevated platforms to provide the swelling crowd a clear view of what was to unfold. The execution was slated for noon, and every element had been meticulously arranged. Charles Henry Sanson, the royal executioner from a lineage steeped in this macabre profession, had been entrusted with the task. Even for a man whose family had administered death for generations, the assignment was daunting. The execution method, tearing by horses, hadn't been enacted in France for decades. Thus, historical texts and the memories of retired executioners were consulted to work out the logistics. 4 robust horses were selected and specially conditioned for the gruesome ordeal. Reports from the time suggest the animals sensed the unnatural nature of their task. They were agitated, difficult to handle, seemingly unwilling to partake in the day's brutality. This eerie resistance was not lost on onlookers. It was as though even the animals recoiled at the horror they were being made to enact. The scaffold stood at the heart of the square, with iron chains and hemp ropes meticulously arranged to restrain Damiens. Implements for the preliminary tortures, glowing pincers, cauldrons of molten lead, and sulfur were readied. The objective was not just physical torment, but a display that would imprint terror and awe in all who witnessed it. As noon drew closer, the crowd thickened, and tension mounted palpably. This was no routine public execution. Everyone knew they were about to witness an ordeal of exceptional cruelty. Spectators from across the nation had journeyed to witness a punishment more reminiscent of medieval savagery than of Enlightenment-era justice. People of every social class were present. Aristocrats occupied choice vantage points in upper windows and balconies, while the working class flooded the alleys and public walkways, all compelled by a chilling curiosity. Vendors moved among the spectators, selling refreshments and treats, turning the grim occasion into something resembling a public fair. The atmosphere buzzed with a strange mix of excitement, unease, and morbid curiosity sentiments that would soon be replaced by collective horror as the brutal reality of the scene unfolded. When Damiens was finally led to the scaffold, he appeared composed, though clearly resigned to his fate. Clothed in a plain white shirt, he seemed smaller and more inconspicuous than many had imagined. There was no sign of a crazed zealot or monstrous figure, only an unremarkable middle-aged man who looked disoriented by the ordeal. His sheer normalcy made the violence about to occur feel even more unsettling. Right at noon, the execution commenced with the tortures laid out in his sentence. Red-hot pincers tore at his flesh, drawing agonized screams from Damiens. Molten lead was poured into his gaping wounds, and his right hand, the one that had touched the king, was seared with burning sulfur until it was scorched black. Throughout these brutal acts, Damiens remained fully conscious, his cries of pain echoing across the hushed square. As appalling as these torments were, they merely served as the introduction to the execution's main spectacle, the dismemberment by horses that would etch this event into historical memory. When the executioners began preparing the ropes to attach to Damiens' limbs, even they hesitated, daunted by the grim task. The crowd, once lively and vocal, had gone unnaturally quiet. The 4 horses were brought into place, each one handled separately. The animals, sensing the charged atmosphere, grew agitated and difficult to command. Ropes were secured tightly around Damiens' arms and legs, linking him to the 4 horses stationed at the corners of the platform. The execution team carefully reviewed their setup, fully aware that what followed would not only test their professional competence, but also their emotional endurance. What transpired next would leave an indelible mark on the memory of everyone present, and ultimately fuel the movement to abolish such cruel punishments in France. What was meant to be a swift, decisive execution turned into a prolonged ordeal, stretching over several unbearable hours. Despite being whipped and goaded, the horses failed to deliver the required force to separate Damiens' limbs from his body. Their reluctance quickly became evident to all present. The animals strained and pulled, causing immense pain as his joints were wrenched to their limits. But his body remained largely intact. Frustrated and desperate, the executioners attempted different methods to compel the horses to pull with more force. Yet nothing proved effective. As time dragged on, the crowd's mood shifted from grim fascination to something much darker and more disturbed. What had begun as a spectacle of grim fascination quickly devolved into something far more harrowing. Those in the crowd who had come to witness swift, albeit cruel justice, instead found themselves subjected to an extended scene of suffering with no apparent end. Some spectators left the square, unable to bear the unfolding horror, while others remained riveted and appalled by the gruesome reality before them. Recognizing that the horses alone could not complete the task, the executioners began to intervene more directly. They made incisions into Damien's joints with knives and saws in an attempt to hasten the dismemberment. Even this escalation did not immediately bring the ordeal to an end. His arms were eventually torn free, but his legs stubbornly resisted separation. Eyewitnesses described the grotesque sounds, bones snapping, flesh ripping that echoed starkly through the silent crowd. Remarkably, Damiens remained alive and lucid for much of the torment. Witnesses recalled him continuing to speak at times, screaming in anguish, at others murmuring prayers or uttering incoherent phrases. His refusal to die, his tenacity in the face of such orchestrated destruction, became another layer of the day's horror. It was as if his very endurance had become an unintended protest against the system that was executing him. The public mood shifted dramatically. What had started as eager anticipation turned into horrified fixation, and finally, outright disgust. Numerous attendees later recounted feeling dizzy or nauseated as the execution dragged on far beyond what anyone had envisioned. It was one thing to support brutal punishment. In theory, witnessing it firsthand exposed the gulf between the abstract idea of justice and its brutal enactment. Eventually, after what historical records describe as hours of relentless agony, Damiens succumbed. His mutilated body was burned, and his ashes dispersed as the sentence had mandated. But the real consequences extended far beyond his death. The true damage was inflicted upon the credibility of the royal justice system that had orchestrated such a display. What had been intended as a vivid display of royal dominance had instead unmasked the monarchy's inherent cruelty and lack of humanity. The immediate response across French society was one of widespread shock, revulsion, and deep introspection. Those who departed the Place de Grève that day did so burdened not only with gruesome memories, but also with serious doubts about the legitimacy of a justice system capable of authorizing such horror. Many who had come expecting a swift, if merciless, punishment were instead left to question the very principles underpinning royal rule. First-hand accounts of the execution from observers across various social classes attest to the profound psychological impact it had. Even officials long accustomed to overseeing executions expressed dismay at what had unfolded. The Marquise de Pompadour, one of Louis XV's closest confidant, was reportedly stricken with nausea after hearing the full details. And the king himself, upon learning how excruciatingly drawn out the execution had been, was said to have voiced sorrow over the harshness of the punishment. The international response was no less remarkable. Diplomats and travelers who witnessed or heard of the execution brought accounts back to their respective nations, where the event was met with a blend of morbid interest and alarm. Thinkers of the Enlightenment throughout Europe seized on the spectacle as proof that beneath the polished surface of so-called civilization still lay profound brutality. Voltaire, long a vocal opponent of torture and inhumane punishment, quickly leveraged the Damiens affair in his advocacy for legal reform. Unexpected repercussions followed for the monarchy itself. Louis XV, who had at first demanded the most severe penalty possible for his assailant, reportedly became deeply troubled by the sheer savagery of Damiens' drawn-out death. Some historians argue that the king's diminished confidence in later political crises can be traced to this very incident, a moment when the harsh realities of unchecked authority were laid bare. The Catholic Church, which had endorsed the punishment as a righteous response to an attack on God's chosen sovereign, also found itself unsettled. The extended torment Damiens endured raised difficult theological debates about the limits of justice, compassion, and redemption. Some members of the clergy began to voice doubts over whether such a punishment could truly be reconciled with Christian teachings on mercy and human worth. Most notably, Damiens' ordeal galvanized reformers who had long argued against judicial torture and excessive cruelty. What had once been a theoretical debate suddenly had a tangible, horrifying reference point. The execution stood as stark evidence of what could occur under an outdated, vengeance-driven legal system. It bolstered calls for a justice rooted in deterrence and rehabilitation, rather than spectacle and retribution. The effect on French law was swift and irreversible. Though the formal abolition of drawing and quartering wouldn't come until the Revolution, the method was never again used in France. The Damiens affair marked the final instance, not because of reform enacted through law, but due to the deep psychological impact it had on those who witnessed or participated in the act. The ramifications of Damiens' death extended well beyond legal precedent. The incident became a key element in the broader disillusionment with absolutism that would help ignite the French Revolution. That the monarchy had ordered such a grotesque and pitiless execution of a powerless man came to symbolize the moral decay at the heart of the Ancien Regime. Enlightenment philosophers and political thinkers wove the Damiens episode into their wider critiques of power and governance. It served as a vivid warning against tyranny and the need to construct legal systems grounded in logic, fairness, and human dignity, not fear. The event became a parable of what happens when rule is upheld, not by legitimacy, but by coercion. The Damiens affair also played a role in reshaping how society viewed mental illness and criminal accountability. His erratic behavior and contradictory statements during his imprisonment prompted some contemporaries to question whether he was mentally sound at the time of his offense. This introduced unsettling questions about the morality of executing someone who may not have fully grasped the nature of his actions. The tale of Robert-François Damiens and his harrowing demise stands as a powerful reminder of both humanity's capacity for brutality and its potential for ethical evolution. What was meant to reaffirm monarchical dominance instead exposed the vulnerability of regimes reliant on coercion and fear. The revulsion of those who witnessed Damiens' execution signaled a pivotal moment in Europe's evolving perceptions of justice and retribution. Damiens' case starkly demonstrates the chasm that can lie between abstract legal doctrine and its real-world application. The system that sentenced him to be torn apart by horses followed long-standing legal customs. Yet, when these customs were enacted, the result was so viscerally horrifying that it unsettled even those who had sanctioned the punishment. What is perhaps most unsettling is the insight the execution offers into how swiftly civilized societies can slip into barbarism when power feels endangered. Damiens was neither a militant agitator nor a seasoned criminal. He was a confused, possibly disturbed domestic servant who posed little threat, and yet the state's response was a display of cruelty, more befitting a medieval inquisition than an Enlightenment-era court. The global spotlight on Damiens' fate also reveals how such gruesome spectacles functioned within the political dynamics of the time. Monarchies across Europe observed France's reaction closely, understanding that their own authority might one day be tested in similar fashion. If the goal was to send a deterrent message, The grotesque nature of the punishment may have done the opposite, offering instead a damning indictment of the excesses of autocratic rule. The eventual rejection of such extreme penalties in the years after Damiens' death stands as a true testament to the triumph of Enlightenment principles. Philosophical arguments for the humane treatment of prisoners, amplified by the disturbing memory of Damiens' fate, drove a powerful wave of legal reform. This shift toward more measured and reasonable forms of justice was part of Europe's broader effort to align its systems with ideals of civility and progress. Still, the Damiens affair remains a cautionary tale, a reminder that beneath the veneer of modernity, the impulse toward cruelty can resurface, especially when those in power feel threatened by the powerless. The horror that unfolded at the Place de Grève in March 1757 illustrates that the human potential for violence has never vanished. It is merely constrained by the moral and legal frameworks we choose to uphold. When those safeguards weaken, the darkness within can all too easily return. The legacy of Robert-François Damiens extends well beyond the immediate terror of his execution. His ordeal became a cornerstone in the intellectual campaign to abolish judicial torture and barbaric punishments, not just in France, but across Europe and eventually worldwide. Enlightenment thinkers like Cesare Beccaria and Voltaire found in Damiens' fate a vivid, undeniable case that lent urgency to their philosophical calls for legal reform. His execution also played a crucial role in the broader erosion of the legitimacy of absolute monarchy, a process that would reach its climax with the French Revolution just 30 years later. The image of royal power reduced to orchestrating the prolonged torture of one powerless man crystallized for many the inherent moral decay of autocratic governance. For revolutionaries, Damiens' story stood as proof of the system's cruel and inhumane foundations. In legal theory, the Damiens case highlighted the need for a more nuanced understanding of mental health and personal accountability in criminal justice. His erratic actions and contradictory justifications sparked debate over whether courts should distinguish between those fully responsible for their behavior and those suffering from psychological disturbances. Though these issues would take generations to fully address, the Damiens affair forced early thinkers to confront them. Public reactions to the execution also marked a pivotal shift in cultural attitudes toward punishment as spectacle. Those who gathered expecting to witness quick, albeit harsh, justice were instead confronted with an appalling display of suffering that shook their assumptions. The revulsion felt by many in the crowd helped set the stage for a gradual movement away from public executions toward more restrained and private methods of enforcement. Internationally, the execution resonated beyond French borders. Visitors and diplomats returned home, carrying tales of the gruesome scene, spreading revulsion that fed into similar reform movements abroad. The Damiens case became a reference point in the growing European discourse about state violence, the scope of legal authority, and the essence of justice itself. Above all, Damiens' story underscores the moral force of individual conscience, standing against entrenched power, even when the consequences are catastrophic. Whether driven by madness, desperation, or conviction, his solitary act was a stand for human dignity against an overwhelming system. Ironically, the brutal death intended to extinguish dissent instead immortalized its subject. Rather than discouraging rebellion, Damiens became a symbol of the strength required to confront tyranny. His fate transcends its time, offering a reflection on authority, resistance, and our shared capacity for cruelty and compassion. The spectacle at Place de Grève in 1757 signaled the decline of an era defined by terror in the name of justice, and the rise of a new understanding, one grounded in humanity. In death, the servant who dared to strike a monarch earned a kind of immortality no sovereign could command, that of someone who sacrificed everything in pursuit of justice and dignity. To this day, the memory of that chilling March afternoon serves as a powerful reminder that the battle between oppressive authority and human dignity is never truly settled. It must be renewed with every generation. The story of Robert-François Damiens remains both a stark warning and a rallying cry for those who refuse to accept injustice in any form.